Dr. Abdullah, can you speak on the academic perspective of Rabaa? It was definitely a youth movement that got this all started. We saw the power of social media bringing everyone together like never before. And it was such an amazing thing to witness. And so from your perspective of working with youth and scholars, and from the academic perspective, what are your thoughts on Rabaa and where we are now?
Well, I think, one of the important things here is the lessons that can be taken away, especially when we consider the prospects for mobilization in the future. We now are looking at a generation of Egyptian youth who for the last 10 years have been fed nothing but the idea that to stand up and to mobilize and to speak would lead to nothing but disaster, right? This is the narrative that's been sealed not just in Cairo or in Egypt, but really across the entire Arab region, is this idea that the Arab uprisings were a colossal failure, that they were a strategic mistake on the part of populations who rose up. And now you have an entire generation who have been fed the lesson that, in fact, it's kind of obedience to, violent, brutal, authoritarian hegemony and authority is the way forward. And all you can do is really find your own kind of individual path to survive this, right? Whether it's through immigration to a Western country, whether it's through finding your own kind of opportunities to work within these horrifically unjust systems that exist economically, socially. We're looking at a country in Egypt that in the last decade ranks dead last in education, right? That this is a regime that has probably willfully and intentionally decided to decimate the education sector to the point where Egyptians now are being educated at the worst level of almost any country in the entire world. So there's something to be said about the fact that there's really a huge crisis within Egyptian society that is very much rooted in the takeover of this regime that has kind of willfully decided to completely disempower, to demobilize its population. And I think one of the other narratives kind of on a more narrow level is to think about this attack in Rabaa and this massacre as not just being an attack or an assault on one specific group or one political party. That's oftentimes obviously what we heard, right? That the military was settling its score against its historic enemy, the Muslim Brotherhood. But this was about, discrediting the entire notion of mobilization against everybody. And I think this is significant because as we look back on this moment, we have to remember that it's not just, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, it's not just the military and the state officials who are responsible, but the climate that would allow for something like this horrific massacre to take place and to unfold was set in motion because there were people among the Egyptian masses, among the various opposition groups and parties, who were not necessarily supporters of the military or an authoritarian resurgence, but people who professed to actually support the revolution themselves, that they believed in the right to mobilize, the right to democracy. And so whether knowingly or unknowingly, they supported those actions because it was against their own political opponents, and ultimately led to the death of that revolution. And certainly there has to be some kind of accounting for that as well. I think we've seen certainly a number of those figures who were outspoken one way at the time, who've since recanted. Many others have not, or have kind of quietly gone away. And of course, a lot of this is due to the horrific compounding of the tragedy, because many of them ended up eventually falling victim to this regime. Many of them ended up in prison. Many of them were forced into exile. And so I hope that there's a kind of a healing that takes place that's in part due to the accountability that comes through recognizing many of the strategic errors that were made, especially those who kind of normalized or at least created the space within Egyptian society that would have allowed this, right? The dehumanization effect had been there for at least a year, if not 2 years, that would have allowed that kind of massacre to take place with people basically looking on and without any real sense of outrage or protest from within society. And then if we expand that beyond Egyptian society to the international level, I think it's worth mentioning in terms of why is it that the international community, as Sarah mentioned, as others have said, have basically stood silently by, and in fact, were rushing to normalize the coup regime as it took over. In fact, we were even debating at this point, this kind of hopeless, pointless discussion, this debate about whether it was even a coup at the time, right? I mean, 10 years later, no one disputes that it's a coup, but at the time, even that was being challenged in certain quarters, especially by governments who, if they were to recognize this as a military coup, would have to reevaluate their policies. And so there's certainly something to be said about what the victims of Rabaa and the Egyptian people have to pay a very high price to allow this regime that's come into place, which of course is now fulfilling many of the goals that we see many Western countries, in particular the US, as we've heard, which has policies, right? John Kerry, when he testified as Secretary of State, and this is all in publicized in David Kirkpatrick's book as well, about what the aims of U.S. foreign policy in Egypt were at the time, and he told Congress that the $2 billion that the U.S. gives Egypt every year is the best investment we've ever made in that region. And so this is in many ways seen as having been delivered a military coup that's going to bring in a state that is ultimately going to fulfill the regional aims and the kind of goals that the U.S. has in the region. And again, all happening at the expense of freedom for the people of Egypt.
Abdullah, any final remarks before you have to head out?
No, I mean, I obviously appreciate the opportunity to be here with people who've contributed much to our understanding of these events, our commemoration. But again, I think the challenge is really on all of us to kind of think about ways of not just learning those lessons, but also kind of making sure that there is continued effort to seek justice for the victims and their families first and foremost, and then think about kind of some of the broader lessons and implications for what this means going forward in terms of any future attempts to bring about any real substantive change, and kind of rediscover that moment that we've seen, and think about what those challenges are going forward. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for having me with you.
Thank you.